Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents I Never Did Like Politics, How Fiorello LaGuardia Became America's Mayor, and Why He Still Matters, by Terry Golway. Narrated by Jon Vertullo. Introduction. Fiorello Henry LaGuardia was America's mayor long before the term was coined. His outsized personality, gift for showmanship, superb leadership skills, and unquestioned integrity made him one of the country's most recognizable politicians in the 1930s and early 40s. I suppose the two best-known names throughout the entire world in this generation are Franklin D. Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia, wrote a friend of both men in 1938. It was a slight exaggeration, but perhaps only slight. Newsreels and photographs distributed around the world showed the short, squat mayor of New York forever in action, squeezing into the sidecar of a police motorcycle as he raced to the scene of a fire, smashing illicit slot machines with an axe, directing civil defense drills, and, most famously, reading the comics on his radio show during a newspaper strike. He was a 5'2" bundle of energy who wore out aides much younger than he. "The mayor's a dynamo," humorist Fred Allen said of LaGuardia. "That's why City Hall has to be kept near the Battery." A music lover who enjoyed guest conducting the New York Philharmonic on occasion, LaGuardia once compared the job of running New York to that of an organist. "You must keep both hands on the keyboard and both feet on the pedals and never let go," he explained. He never did. His work ethic knew no bounds, and neither did his personal integrity. He was simply incorruptible, and he had nothing but contempt for those who inhabited the gray spaces where right and wrong are allowed to mingle. He told cops to get out if they didn't want to be held accountable for their actions. He accused other politicians, not always fairly, of moral if not of financial corruption. An infuriated colleague once demanded that somebody hit the little wop with a gavel after LaGuardia delivered a particularly cutting remark. The ugly insult was commonly hurled at LaGuardia, who was the nation's first Italian-American member of Congress. He generally replied in kind, in one of the 5 languages he spoke. He saw politics not as a road to riches or as an avenue to fame, but as a public service, with an emphasis on public, for he saw himself as a representative of ordinary people, not of the era's plutocrats and power brokers, and he persuaded himself, and sought to persuade others, that he was anything but a mere politician. "I never did like politics," he insisted in a letter written in the early 1940s, more than a quarter century after he won his first election. No doubt this revelation would have come as a surprise to his fellow New Yorkers, so many of whom enjoyed the relish and enthusiasm he brought to his duties in City Hall. When he saw democracy under attack, whether from within, with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, or abroad, with the rise of European fascism in the early 1930s, he spoke up loudly, clearly, and angrily. So harsh were his condemnations of Adolf Hitler before World War II that the State Department apologized to the Nazi government for the bellicose mayor's words. In his next anti-Hitler speech, LaGuardia made sure his insults were even more barbed. He came of age politically just over a century ago, in a time not unlike our own. Cultural divisions pitted cities against rural areas, new Americans against the native-born. Demagogues warned that the nation's Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity was in decline, with moral collapse sure to follow. Nativists in Washington imposed new immigration restrictions to keep America great. The historic migration of Southern black people to the North was underway, challenging white supremacy in supposedly more progressive cities like New York. Many Americans turned inward, rejecting the internationalism of Woodrow Wilson and his allies, who believed a globally connected world would be more peaceful. The nation's newspapers and magazines celebrated wealth and fame, even as urban families crowded into unhealthy tenements, and parts of rural America lacked access to electricity. As a member of Congress and then as the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia attacked the problems of his times with a rare mixture of ideology and pragmatism, seasoned with integrity. He spoke from firm belief and from an absolute confidence in his own conscience. He was sure he knew right from wrong, and he had the courage to make those distinctions regardless of whom they offended or why. Nobody fed him talking points. None of his positions were crafted by consultants. He was his own person, and if you liked it, great. If not, you knew better than to expect him to change. He is best known today for his tenure as mayor, and as a name attached to an airport that he was instrumental in building, to the embarrassment of those who dubbed the project Fiorello's Folly. But there was much more to Fiorello LaGuardia than those 12 years in New York's City Hall, important though they were. The broad sweep of his career as a multilingual agitator, as a prodder of the nation's conscience, as a patriot who volunteered for war service, and as a friend to the voiceless, has lessons for America in the divided, chaotic, and dangerous first quarter of the 21st century. Famed though he is, there is much that has been forgotten about LaGuardia's leadership, courage, and integrity. Now is a good time to remember those qualities. To be sure, his righteousness and dedication to duty made him a demanding boss, and yet he inspired devotion and loyalty from those who worked for him. Ernest Cuneo, who served as a young congressional aide for LaGuardia, noted that he and his colleagues knew what it was like to be chewed out for work judged to be less than satisfactory. It wasn't pleasant. But underlying everything else, he wrote, was a solid foundation of profound respect and affection we were not ashamed to call by its right name: love. LaGuardia's 3 terms as New York's mayor, stretching from 1934 to 1945, remained the standard by which his successors have been measured. All have fallen short. Part of his durability can be attributed to the times and circumstances, for he benefited from New Deal funding that he used to rebuild and reimagine New York for the 20th century and beyond. He was hugely fortunate that a fellow New Yorker, Franklin Roosevelt, was in the White House, and even more fortunate that the two men got along famously. No other local official had the kind of access to the Oval Office that LaGuardia did, and he was not shy about using that access on behalf of his more than 7 million constituents. But LaGuardia's legacy and his enduring presence in the life of the city he led is measured not just in projects completed or promises kept. His spirit, energy, and chutzpah made him simply unforgettable. A short man with an inescapable shadow. He was an authentic populist, a barely educated but street-smart son of immigrants suspicious of social superiors and contemptuous of politicians, a job title he rejected for himself with a curl of his lip and a well-chosen expletive. He could give voice to the concerns of ordinary people because he was never far from their experience. During most of his mayoralty, he and his wife, Marie, and their 2 children lived in a modest walk-up in East Harlem. He knew the price of a pound of beef in local grocery stores. He saw how the rackets ruined the lives of workingmen and their families. He once showed up late for a speech because, as he told his audience, he had to iron his wrinkled suit. Given his casual disregard for fashion, it's doubtful anyone would have noticed, but it made for a good and entirely credible story. From his first real job as a diplomatic official in Eastern Europe to his years as a translator on Ellis Island and throughout his decades in politics, LaGuardia sided with the powerless, calling attention to injustices and outrages that would have otherwise been politically ignored or aggressively dismissed. He assailed the anti-Semitism of auto magnate Henry Ford on the floor of Congress at a time when his colleagues were praising Ford as a genius and making plans, which LaGuardia helped to foil, to turn over a valuable federal property to him. And he walked the streets of Harlem one summer's night in 1943, pleading for peace after anger, tension, and rumors touched off a deadly race riot. While his election as mayor in 1933 remains a significant milestone for New York and urban America, LaGuardia already enjoyed a national reputation as an independent-minded Republican member of Congress beginning in 1917. He didn't stick around Washington very long at first, for when the country went to war in Europe, he signed up for the Army's air service, was deployed to Italy, and soon gained fame as the Flying Congressman. When he returned to Congress in 1923, after a short tenure as president of New York City's Board of Aldermen, which was disbanded in 1937 in favor of a new city council, he was quick to choose sides in the culture wars of the 1920s, fighting battles that sound familiar a century later. He railed against the virulent nativism that gave birth to new immigration restrictions, which he saw as directed against people like him and his parents. He mocked the moralistic hypocrisy of prohibition by brewing his own beer in his congressional office on a street corner in New York, practically begging to be arrested. The police declined to cooperate, wisely. He supported measures to create a better social safety net for the working class, and rejected claims made in Congress and in learned journals that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants had a special claim on American identity. He deplored the racism and anti-Semitism his colleagues took for granted. He lost re-election to the House in 1932, when Roosevelt led a Democratic sweep of federal offices throughout the country. But he was back on the campaign trail in a matter of months, winning a three-way race for mayor of New York City on his third attempt at that office. It was a job for which he had been preparing most of his life, whether he knew it or not. And it was the job that would make him a political and cultural icon of his day and ours. When LaGuardia died of pancreatic cancer in 1947 at the age of 64, he left behind $8,000 worth of war bonds and a mortgaged home in the Bronx. That was the sum total of his real holdings. His actual legacy was and continues to be measured not by the contents of his bank account, but by the character of his personality. What follows is a chronicle of LaGuardia's pursuits, arranged into 4 themes that characterized his life and career. From the dusty streets of Prescott, Arizona, where he spent his formative years, to the sidewalks of New York, upon which he tripped the light fantastic. He was a patriot, a dissenter, a leader, and a statesman, in addition to many other things. But those 4 roles remind us of what made him so popular and effective, and why he still holds such an important place in the collective memory of New York and the nation. Americans born decades after LaGuardia's death know his name, and not just because they've flown in or out of LaGuardia Airport in Queens. He is one of those rare political figures whose reputation and legacy have stood the test of time. Still, even longtime political observers of LaGuardia's native city, this writer included, very likely have forgotten or perhaps never knew of the remarkable life he led before becoming mayor. His role as a young and very undiplomatic diplomat in Eastern Europe, his war service over the skies of Italy while a sitting member of Congress, his vigorous opposition to the Gatsby-esque ethos of the Roaring Twenties, and his work for social and racial justice. And while his dozen years in City Hall have served as the basis for numerous books, biographies, and even a Broadway musical, there still are countless moments. A beautifully delivered wisecrack, a public display of righteous anger, an act of political courage that will inspire a new appreciation for one of the 20th century's most revered political leaders. All these years later, the man can still take you by surprise. Part 1. Patriot. Patriotism must be spontaneous and not legislated. Fiorello LaGuardia was a man of boundless energy and strong-willed certainty, his excitable, high-pitched voice like a siren in the night, warning the comfortable and the crooked alike that he was on his way to challenge the status quo and to champion the powerless. He was quick to attack the hypocrisy and injustice of his times. He was rarely content and never far from a spasm of rage when his country sought to reserve its blessings for those already enriched. And that's what made him a patriot of the first order. No, he was not a flag-waving loudmouth proclaiming love of the stars and stripes on the 4th of July and then ignoring the nation's ideals the rest of the year. LaGuardia's patriotism was deep and abiding. The patriotism of a man whose parents left their homes in Europe to find a better life where the streets were paved with the gold of opportunity. Yes, he could add some purple to his red, white, and blue oratory, using language that, from the mouths of others, might seem like so much empty pandering. The American flag, he told a crowd on Staten Island in the 1920s, was the greatest emblem of liberty the world has ever seen. But he was equally effusive when he found fault. His criticisms of injustice and inequality were always pointed, and they cut deeply because they were sharpened by disappointment. When he saw poverty and injustice, when he saw men and women of privilege adopting the trappings of aristocracy, he judged these things to be quite literally anti-American. He saw himself carrying out his patriotic duty when he defended unpopular speech against the attacks of the easily offended, when he supported the rights of labor to organize, strike, and picket, and when he vetoed a law in New York City that would have required the display of an American flag at any civic gathering of more than 15 people. Patriotism must be spontaneous and not legislated, he said in 1935 as he vetoed the flag bill. Patriotism can no more be instilled in a disloyal person by the forced presence of our flag than can the love of God be put into an atheist's heart by placing a Bible in his hand. Because his was the patriotism of the eternal idealist, and because he had a flair for the dramatic, his criticisms and dissents often were operatic in their fury and extravagance. Few commentators and even fewer politicians were capable of being as withering as LaGuardia could be when the nation let him down, or when officials high or low put the well-being of the few ahead of the interests of the many. When Herbert Hoover and his allies in Congress sought legislation to protect banks against a cascade of mortgage defaults during the Depression, the fiery congressman from New York let loose with a barrage. "I'm not going to let them get away with it," he said of his fellow Republicans. "The bastards broke the people's back with their usury. Let them die. The people will survive." Equally passionate, however, were his invocations of the nation's highest ideals. He gleefully presided over several star-spangled mass gatherings in Central Park during World War II to commemorate I Am an American Day, during which immigrants took their oath of citizenship, renouncing their loyalty to their native lands. But he had no patience with immigrants ambivalent about celebrating their new identity. "Those who prefer Italy to America should return to Italy," he told a gathering of Italian Americans during World War I. He wore his heart on his sleeve. He wore his service on his collar, where, while he was in the armed services, he pinned the oak leaf clusters he earned as a major. And that was the title he preferred, in much the same way that Theodore Roosevelt was always Colonel Roosevelt, even after serving as president. For those in the know, LaGuardia was always Major LaGuardia. He actually sought a promotion during World War II, pleading with his friends in the White House and with President Franklin Roosevelt himself for an appointment as a brigadier general in early 1943, anticipating the inevitable Allied invasion of Italy in the coming months. LaGuardia thought his experience in World War I would be an asset for General Dwight Eisenhower and his troops once they began their slog up the Italian boot. There was no denying his courage. "I don't mind getting killed in action," he told an army official, but he didn't get the chance to put his life on the line, to his disappointment. It would be a mistake, though, to confuse LaGuardia's deep patriotism with mere wartime jingoism. Yes, he was eager to answer his country's call, not just in the 2 world wars, but even in the Spanish-American War when he was a teen. But he actually abhorred war. As a member of Congress in the 1920s, he introduced a resolution declaring that all war should be considered a crime and that the United States should support a movement to outlaw armed conflict. "Pacifism is patriotism," he said. Few would have agreed with him, at the time and even today. And in LaGuardia's view, that was patriotic as well. 1. New Americans. There was no Statue of Liberty to greet and inspire a pair of newlyweds, Achille LaGuardia and Irene Cohen LaGuardia, as they sailed into New York Harbor in 1880. The lady who would soon become a symbol of the New World's promise had yet to be assembled on a spit of earth called Bedloe's Island. The words that would one day adorn her pedestal, "A welcome to the poor and tired," had yet to be written. The great city that the LaGuardias would now call home was on the verge of electing an immigrant from Ireland, W.R. Grace, as mayor, even as hostile newspapers questioned whether he was a legal citizen of the United States. Achille and Irene were in the vanguard of a new kind of immigration, exiles from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, Italians, Jews, and others whose lives, beliefs, customs, and traditions were very different from the Irish and Germans who had crossed the Atlantic in the preceding 4 decades. To 21st century eyes, the change would seem to be little more than a variation on a theme, for, like the majority of native-born, most of the new immigrants were white. Whether they were accepted as white is another story entirely. And most were Christians of some sort or another, with the obvious exception being the Eastern European Jews in flight from the pogroms of Tsarist Russia. At the time of their arrival in the late 19th century, however, the Italians, Hungarians, Poles, and Yiddish-speaking Russian Jews were hardly thought to share very much in common with the Irish and Germans who arrived a generation earlier, never mind the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who considered themselves true Americans. The LaGuardias would have 2 children within 3 years of settling in New York. One of them, their son, Fiorello, whose first name meant little flower in Italian, would know what it was like to be referred to as a wop, and worse, not simply by cruel children, but also by his colleagues in Congress and New York's City Hall. They looked at this rumpled, small man with a vowel-enriched name and saw somebody who was not one of them, not like them. Indeed, somebody who threatened them. Migrants like Irene and Achille LaGuardia posed new questions about what it meant to be an American. Irene was a Jew born in 1859 in the city of Trieste, then under control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Achille was born a decade earlier to a Catholic family in Foggia, on Italy's Adriatic coast. But in matters of religious faith, he identified himself as having none. They came to America because they saw no future for themselves in the old country, where a marriage between a Jew and a Catholic, especially one who rejected the faith of his parents, was uncommon and unwelcome. They were not in steerage with the huddled masses. They were nobody's rejected refuse. Achille was the son of a government official, a talented musician who performed in towns throughout Italy and on ships that took him to New York as a young man. Irene was reared in a cosmopolitan city of several nationalities in what is today northeast Italy, near the border with Slovenia. They met at a dance, were married after a 6-month courtship, and soon were on their way to America, not because they lacked opportunity or were hungry, but simply because they wished for the freedom to be themselves, without the overbearing constraints of tradition. Achille had been to New York. He knew it was a place where a Jew from Trieste and a non-believer from Foggia could go about their business without eliciting the scowls of neighbors and the disapproval of family. They were among 300,000 Italians who passed through the nation's first ever official immigration center in an old military installation called Castle Garden in downtown Manhattan in the 1880s. The number of Italians coming through New York Harbor doubled in the decade after the LaGuardias arrived and exploded during the first decade of the 20th century, when 2 million Italians entered the United States through Castle Garden's replacement facility on Ellis Island, where for a few years they might have been helped by a young Italian-speaking translator named Fiorello LaGuardia. Most Italians who settled in New York started their new lives in a neighborhood that looked, sounded, and smelled like something they left behind. A slice of downtown Manhattan, centered on Mulberry Street, had been transformed into what became known as Little Italy, a neighborhood filled with restaurants, bakeries, and butchers that brought a touch of Naples to New York City. But the LaGuardias chose the new rather than the familiar. Achille and Irene found an apartment in Greenwich Village, a gathering place, even then, for intellectuals and artists, some of whom were born in the United States, others fellow migrants from a handful of European countries, and still others of African descent. This, and not the ethnic fortress of Little Italy, was where the LaGuardias felt at home. The older LaGuardias surely learned something about the diversity of their adopted country from the extraordinary mosaic that lay just outside their doorstep. Their children, however, would have to absorb such lessons in a very different sort of setting. Fiorello, born in 1882, and his older sister, Gemma, born in 1881, were small children when Achille joined the U.S. Army as a musician in 1885, putting an end to their life in New York and introducing them to the high peaks of the Adirondacks, the vast expanse of the Great Plains, and the dusty grandeur of the Southwest. A third LaGuardia child, Richard, was born on an army base in South Dakota in 1887. The man who would one day represent a portion of Manhattan in Congress and serve as mayor of the country's largest city for a dozen years had no memories of his earliest years as a native New Yorker. Fiorello LaGuardia was no street kid, despite his love of rough and tumble. Rather, he was a child of the military, who moved from base to base as his father's career unfolded. That experience certainly provided the young Fiorello with an appreciation for those who, like his immigrant father, put service to country above self. And he fell in love with the freedom and the possibilities that the American West represented. God's country, he called it. Our playground was not measured in acres or in city blocks, but in miles and miles. On the army posts and in the small towns the posts supported, the energetic young boy came in contact with American diversity in a form very different from what his parents found in Greenwich Village. He would recall speaking with Native Americans, miners, railroad laborers from Mexico and Italy, and of course, soldiers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?